The following program presents principles designed to promote good health and is not intended to take the place of personalized professional care. The opinions and ideas expressed are those of the speaker. Viewers are encouraged to draw their own conclusions about the information presented.
Hello and welcome to Health for a Lifetime. I'm your host Don McIntosh, and today we're going to be talking about a very interesting subject. Our guest is Rob McClintock. He's written a book entitled God's Healing Leaves. It's about herbs. Welcome, and tell us a little bit, what are herbs? Why should we be interested in them?
Well, thank you, Don. Herbs are a very interesting topic, and in recent times they've come to the forefront of a lot of people's attention. You know, we have the savory herbs in the kitchen, but then we have the medicinal herbs, and those are the ones people are focusing on today. You know, generations past, people were very interested, and almost every mother, almost every grandmother understood how to take care of at least some forms of illnesses using, you know, the traditional plants of the field. Today there's a new interest. I think the reason that it went away, you know, along came people like Salk and Fleming, and you know, the vaccinations and the new wonder drugs, and we were able to control a lot of disease through those means. Today people are beginning to look for what some people call bio-friendly alternatives, and not without reason, because some of the interventive processes that standard medicine has today, you know, sometimes there's some problems with those. And, you know, last year in the media, one of the major newspapers put out a report that each year in America, 2.2 million Americans have a drug interaction problem between two medications that they're taking. You know, that's a concern to some people. A more recent report that I read the other day, 1 out of 300 patients on one singular medicine has a reaction to that particular medicine, and sometimes even a violent critical reaction, sometimes even causing death. You know, that type of thing gets picked up by the public, and they begin to become alarmed, and they begin to feel, well, the plants of the field are more friendly, they're more gentle, they're safer. That's the route I want to go because I'm afraid of these other things. And, you know, there's an up and a downside to all of these things.
Yeah, I mean, just listening to you talk and knowing something about what they do with these medicines that then come down to the consumer, you know, the federal FDA, they test these things. They have research that goes over many, many different subjects before they ever would release something. And so my question would be, aren't there risks that are associated with herbs?
There certainly are. And with herbs, I think that if people want to use them in their healthcare program, personally, I think that before they begin to use them, they need to begin with some education. And I personally felt a great deal of distress, you know, quite a number of years ago as I began to develop my own personal interest in trying to find reliable information. I would read 6 different books, and I would get 6 different opinions with, you know, 6 different sets of conflicting information. It was very, very hard for me to understand you know, how they worked or if they worked, and it appeared that all plants did everything. They were, you know, every plant of the field was a panacea. In recent times, you'll notice that both non-traditionalists and traditionalists in the medical field are all looking to the plants. You know, every year we have a tremendous amount of research. You know, chemists, biochemists, and botanists discover and study a lot of plants, and we're beginning to see modern medicine use a lot of plant medicine. But again, education is very, very important because you can hurt yourself with some of these plants.
So what can we do to well, first of all, I mean, what kind of plants do we use? And I mean, I wouldn't know what to do. Do I go out in my backyard? There's 10, 15 different types of plants. How do I know what to use, and how do I know what not to use?
Okay, those are very, very valid questions, and they're questions that, you know, the consumer needs specifically to ask themselves and to ask other people. The reason that I wrote that book was because there was so much misinformation. And it's not because I am America's #1 guru in plant medicine today. There are so many people who know, a lot more than what I do know about it. But I tried to compile information that was safe. You need to understand to some extent the chemical constituents of the plant, what it does, what it doesn't do, how it affects the human physiology. There are courses, correspondence courses. Many communities have people who will teach those courses. You can buy some of the newer books in the bookstores today actually have some real information. The older books, like Culpepper's Herbal and some of these, from prior centuries, they were involved more in superstition than they were in actual, biochemical understanding.
So what you're talking about is education and getting a grasp of basic principles and then figuring out what these plants do. Is there any real uniformity, though? Even at this point, you're saying, hey, there's all kinds of different books, but how can someone have a real level of comfort knowing, hey, before I take this plant, I know what's going to happen?
Well, today's books, the books that have been written, say, in the last 5 years, are certainly more reliable than the ones that were written at the turn of the century and, and then through the ensuing decades. Of course, as an author, I'd like to always feel like my book has, all of the strengths, and it has some strengths and some weaknesses as well. But I like to find books that have some cited research in them. When I actually this book actually came as a compilation of my lecture notes from seminars that I would teach around the world, and people would say, I want your lecture notes, and so I crunched it into a book. But you'll find a lot of books on the shelves today where you can actually find where they cite clinical research. The books that say you should use a plant because it's shaped like a heart and that heart-shaped plant will be good for your heart, and this plant that is furry, that'll be good for your hair, and these types of books, really, truly, those are things that they're out.
So you're saying to me, if I'm looking into this and I want to start using plants, I should, first of all, if the book is not written within the last 5 years or so, and then avoiding these other things within a book, even if it has been written within the last 5 years. That's a good way in terms of looking at resources. How can someone get help? Who can they talk to? I don't think I would go down the street to just anybody off the street and say, will you help me with some plants? And it sounds like I need to be a little worried about who I talk to, listening to what you're saying. Well,
I think that probably in this day and age, doing your own research is probably the smartest thing you can do. Because I would say, well, in every community there's some lady who knows something. I found in every community that when I've met these people who knew something, that they had a lot of superstition mixed in, a lot of old wives' tales, a lot of New Age philosophies, the positive and the negative influences, and these plants happen to react stronger with the yin than the yang, and all these types of things. You have to be a scholar. You have to be a student. Just like with the Bible, you could say, well, where could I go to find good information on the Bible? Well, there's a ton of people out there who claim to have good information on the Bible, but we have to be scholars in our own right. We have to understand a couple of rules that I would say as you're evaluating whether or not the information is credible. I would like to see that it has some association, perhaps, with some clinical research trials. I'd like to see some lists of chemical constituents so that if you have any chemistry background or any physics or any anatomy and physiology, you can understand how these chemicals will react with the body. The plant should be, this information about the plant should be specific about its use and not vague. One of the things that I detested about some of the books that I had in my library at one time is you'd pick it up and it seemed like any plant would work with any condition. I like to see some specificity with all of the plants. And one of the final things that I felt like needed to be addressed was dosage levels. Most of the books you'll pick up today do not address maximum and minimum dosage levels in a practical experiential level.
So addressing how much you get from a certain plant, and how can you really come up with that? Let's say, I grow my plants in my backyard and they have more chemicals in the earth there. It seems to not be as depleted as where you live or vice versa. How can you really get a handle on what the dosage is of any given plant?
Well, that's a real credible challenge, and all people who work in the field are faced with that. You'll notice that in, say, some of the health food stores today, that we're beginning to see plants coming out in a form called standardized extracts, like, you know, the St. John's wort that everybody's taking for the clinical depression today. The rule of thumb in the industry today is a 3% standardized extract, where they actually take the plant into a lab and they crunch out the chemical constituent, and it's measurable. That's probably in a touchy situation, maybe a little better way to go, but you know, there are a lot of plants probably in your yard, in your neighborhood, that you could use, you know, fairly safely. We find that within pharmaceuticals, you have precise amounts of milligrams or micrograms associated with the particular chemicals. In the plants, the chemical constituent dosage levels are not as intense or as strong, and so your margin between your minimum and your maximum dosage levels is quite broad. So, you know, if you're in the middle of the road, there's, you know, a pretty slim chance that you'll ever hurt yourself.
Okay, so in other words, it usually is not as potentially dangerous unless you eat something like poison ivy inadvertently. But, you know, imagine that looking for these plants and identifying them is another big thing if you're going to actually be harvesting the plants yourself and growing them and whatnot. But let me ask you another question. You know, we've talked a little bit about the theory, and it seems as though you've gotten involved in this and given seminars around the country, written a book, have a web page, all those different kind of things. So you're up on these things on your fingertips. Well, let's say I have like a chest cold or a head cold. How do I know what to do right then? Normally I'd grab for some Tylenol, I'd grab for some you know, antihistamine or whatever to take away some of those symptoms. What do I do when I have a symptom? How do I know what to do?
Well, you know, from your clinical background, you're used to the terminology. And I think all of us need to some extent be used to the terminology. And in plants, a good book, plant medicine books will say this plant works as a decongestant, this plant works as an antihistamine, you know, this plant will work as an expectorant, this one is an anti-inflammatory, this one mimics, you know, steroids, that type of thing. All of that type of information is very useful as we study the plants to find out that there are plants that will fall into the same categories as the other types of medications that we're used to, and we can use these, you know, bio-friendly forms in place of these things with comparative ease.
Okay, so we have this idea of what they do and how and why, but again, back, now I have a cold. What do I do? What are the steps I go through to get to that plant that I'm going to be chomping on in a few minutes?
Okay. Well, again, understanding which plant you want. If you've never ever tried it before, it's probably a good idea to ask somebody with some experience in it rather than making your very first leap by just trying to cookbook it. I've been amused sometimes to see people who pick up a book and try to cookbook their way through something that's very unknown to them. You know, recently I had to take the motor out of my car and put a new engine back together and put it together, and I'm trying to use these books. These books are written specifically about my year and make of car, and still there were ambiguities and questions in my mind, and I would wonder, and I'd find that I would actually find an expert mechanic and say, listen, you know, do I put this on here this way, or do I put it on there that way? And I would find people who were familiar with it would help me quite a bit. But let's say that you were just going to try and pick up a book, like the book that you have in your hands. You know, of course, you go to the index, you look for the plants, things that would be expectorants, things that, you know, if you've got a lot of mucus that you need to rid from the body, you know, a good expectorant would be in hand. We have plants that are antihistamines. We have plants that are analgesic for, you know, the aches and that type of things. You know, how would I treat, you know, let's say a bronchitis or a cold or something like that?
Why don't we stop right there? You got the book, you're looking at it, and you're saying how to treat a bronchitis, a chest cold. When we come back, we're going to take a break. I want you to just work us through that. Maybe take a couple things and work through that, and come back and join us. We're going to get into some specifics now, maybe a problem you're having, Join us when we come back.
Have you found yourself wishing that you could shed a few pounds? Have you been on a diet for most of your life, but not found anything that will really keep the weight off? If you've answered yes to any of these questions, then we have a solution for you that works. Dr. Hans Deal and Dr. Eileen Ludington have written a marvelous booklet called Reversing Obesity Naturally, and we'd like to send it to you free of charge. Here's a medically sound approach successfully used by thousands who were able to eat more and lose weight permanently without feeling guilty or hungry through lifestyle medicine. Dr. Deal and Dr. Ludington have been featured on 3ABM, and in this booklet, they present a sensible approach to eating, nutrition, and lifestyle changes that can help you prevent heart disease, diabetes, and even cancer. Call or write today for your free copy of Reversing Obesity Naturally, and you could be on your way to a healthier, happier you. It's absolutely free of charge, so call or write today.
Welcome back. We've been talking with Rob McClintock, who has written a book on herbs. And just before the break, we were talking about bronchitis, and we were talking about what we would do about it. We've talked about, you know, some preliminary things about herbs and all this, but then I ask you to address something when we come back. I've called you up now, and I say, hey, look, I've got this terrible cold. It seems to be a pain in my upper chest, and I'm just feeling terrible, and I'm ready to try an herb. I need help. What would you say to me, and what would be the next step?
Well, Don, one of the things that I would have to do responsibly would be to kind of put the herb question on the back burner, because no one successfully puts a roof on a house that you haven't built a foundation under first. And we don't just use plants to either cure or cover up a symptom. The first thing I'd want to know is, are you getting adequate rest? You know, have you taken time off from work? Are you getting exercise? Are you getting fresh air? Are you drinking enough fluids? Have you restricted your intakes of fats and salts and sugars, and, you know, all of these sort of things? I want to get a background to find out whether you are the cause or, you know, there is another cause for it. I would also find out how much understanding you had, or what resources you had as far as availability to hydrotherapy, because with the bronchitis, you know as well as anybody else, you know, the old-fashioned chest packs with the hot and cold alternating therapy over the chest area, probably one of the most effective means in treating this sort of a condition. But after we've done this homework and I found out that you're doing all of these things and you're doing them right, or you've agreed to make a transition in one area or another, to come down to the actual plant side of what we do with an herb. If you're, you know, coughing and you'd like to have a more productive cough, to actually cough, you know, some material up and get it out, we have a number of plants in the plant kingdom that are expectorants. Horehound, you know, my dad used to give me this dreadful tasting candy when I was a kid, horehound candy. I tried it not too long ago just to see if it was as bad as it used to be, and it still was. I guess some people like it, but it wasn't my favorite. But horehound was more than just a flavoring. Horehound actually has an expectorant quality to it. Mullein, a plant that grows wild all over the country. Comfrey, there's a number of plants that actually have an expectorant quality to those. Those would be some plants that I would put into an herbal combination to make an herbal tea from, to help try and bring some of that out. Part of bronchitis is, you know, if you've ever suffered with it, you know that you tend to get a lot of spasticity in the bronchial ways, and in your chest. You know, they get irritated, they get reactive, they're tired of coughing, they wish you'd quit. But you still continue because the sensation's there. There are a number of plants that are antispasmodics. We have plants like, you know, like the black cohosh and valerian, some of these plants that you can add a little bit of those into your blend that actually help take out some of that spasticity. From the side of inflammation, one of the things that works really great is an old-fashioned tea of licorice root. Works really well at helping to bring down that inflammation there. And then one final thing that I would add to try and soothe the area, there's a number of mucilagenic herbs like chickweed and marshmallow root. You'd add those, and all of that working in concert with one another. Drink a quart or so of that tea a day. If you're doing your homework with the other things, you should see it clear up quite rapidly.
Well, a couple of questions then on that. You've talked about several different things. One to help us cough, an expectorant. One to help us with inflammation. One to help us with spasticity or feeling bad. All these different things. I guess where you can help us is knowing what to mix with what when, because this is not something that we normally would know how to do and probably would be afraid to do it, mixing several different things together. And any pointers on that you would give us, and then secondly, how long? You've said this would clear up quite rapidly, but what does that mean?
Well, with most of the cases of these types of coughs and bronchitis that we've seen in the last, say, 5 years, it usually clears it up in just a matter of a few days. I guess bronchitis or a flu bug right now seems to be the plague of the day as we're speaking. We both came in on airplanes, and I think the airplanes were vibrating from everybody hacking, and God bless us, I hope we survived the contamination that we got in these things. But a few days, probably you should see a major amount of relief from that. As far as the combining of plants can be very complicated or it can be very simple. And I think rather than taking chances, we need to know what the plants do. Every plant falls into a category. How do I know what I mix with what and what I don't? Some people are afraid because they're afraid that they'll cause some dreadful chemical reaction because there are chemicals in the plants. But to those people, I asked them if they've ever eaten a tossed salad. Well, certainly they have. They didn't explode. They didn't, they didn't break into flames. So, there's a fair amount of safety in that. You know from being in your nursing background, you know what a diaphoretic is. It's a
makes you sweat.
Makes you sweat.
Right.
And then you take a plant that's a refrigerant. Well, you wouldn't mix those two together because the net effect is nothing.
Nothing.
You need to know what category. You need to know what plants are refrigerants and what plants are diaphoretics and what plants are antispasmodics, anti-inflammatories. All of those plants, if you know what category they're in, then you know how to apply them.
So maybe one of the things we could say, this seems like a very reasoned approach, that you're saying, hey, look at the basics first. Try some simple things like fluids and all of this and see what's happening there. But maybe one of the other things we could say is, hey, start out simple. Maybe take something that helps you have a productive cough, see how that works. Then you know how that works. Then adding more later as you learn more. But really the fundamentals are still there. Would that be wise to say?
That's very correct. What you're talking about is handling the things that you're capable and happy with. The last thing you want to do is grab a book and then race across the street to your neighbor who has terminal cancer and begin to practice some new experimental art. You want to deal with those things that you are competent in dealing with, and then as you gain experience, you'll be able to, add layer upon layer to your experience level to where you can actually become very proficient at quite a number of things.
I noticed here on the note some of the things that we looked at, we may talk about. Something that really gripped my attention was there's treatments for bleeding with herbs. And I'm wondering what that's all about. How can you treat bleeding? I mean, I'm picturing someone that has cut their finger and it's really bleeding really, really hard. Is that what you're talking about?
Correct. Or we can do it internally or externally. If it's internal and it's in the GI tract somewhere, I mean, it's not where you've...
You mean like the stomach, the intestines?
Right. Correct. If there's quite a number of conditions, ulcerative colitis, ulcers, and these types of things. Sometimes there is a number of opportunities for bleeding there. We have a couple of different plants that are here in North America that work very well internally, and they happen to work very well externally as well. There's one that I know grows in this region of the country, right outside the studio, and that's our little, American cranesbill or a wild geranium plant. If you were to, if you were bleeding, you could actually take the root or the rhizome of the plant and break that open, make a tea, slit it, make a quick application, either internally or externally. It has a very powerful astringency in it, and it will stop the bleeding almost instantaneously.
So topically, if you put it on that finger that's bleeding, it's a vasoconstrictor.
Correct.
In other words, it makes those vessels come together. Is that what you're saying?
They'll come together and the bleeding will stop. It increases the coagulation. It'll stop almost instantly. The other one that some people are a little intimidated in using is the cayenne pepper. But I can
see why they might be a little intimidated.
I've seen so many times where somebody's bleeding quite profusely, and you'll just take a little handful of cayenne pepper powder and just pack it in there. And yes, there is some sensory stimulus there. You know something got on there, but it's a whole lot better than bleeding.
Interesting. I notice here you have other things to treat, for instance, infection, arthritis, PMS, the common cold, impacted sinuses. We can't get into all of those different ones, but in our last minute here, what advice would you have? You know, people are watching now. I know that you've perked an interest in me, and you. What would you say in just summary? Some principles for folks that are wanting to get more into this area.
Again, I think education is the number one. Your first responsibility is to seek out good information. And there's a lot of information available. You can find things on the internet, but you'll have to understand that you'll need to choose your orientation. Do you want to take it from a Christian scientific approach, or do you want to approach it from the New Age philosophy? Because there's two different philosophies, and the New Age philosophy is actually an Old Age philosophy. It goes back to all kinds of ancient things. You need to figure out which way you want to head. I hope our viewers, watching a Christian broadcast station, are interested in the Christian philosophy, because that's where you want to go into the scientific perspective. Get some good books. Listen to some people. Don't just have one book, and don't just listen to one person. You need to be a scholar.
We've been talking with Rob McClintock. He's written a book, God's Healing Leaves, and we've talked about several, the theory of herbs, and we've talked about what to do if you're not feeling well and how to really kind of troubleshoot there. We hope that this has been helpful to you today. Really, our whole purpose here on Health for a Lifetime is to help you have that health for a lifetime. I think the things we've learned today have been practical, they've been useful, and I'm looking forward to doing another program where we come back and look at some of these other things. And I think that we'll find it equally as interesting to see the how to really put some of these things into practice in our own lives. Thanks for joining us.